In this video, we will be ranking every single Merfolk 1-drop that's legal in the modern format, since one element that modern Merfolk decks are lacking is a good 1-drop, and while none of our options are great, some are much better than others. So with that said, let's get into the video. In 24th place is Merfolk Secretkeeper. Now, milling our opponent's deck in most cases just helps our opponent, and milling our own deck can also just help our opponent. So the first ability is not used, and you are basically just playing a 0/4 creature, which is good at blocking, but nothing else. That's why it's number 24. Next, in 23rd place is Merfolk Witsniper. This card would be better with no abilities, because you have to mill cards when it enters the battlefield. The enter the battlefield effect is a drawback. Putting a downside on a 1/1 vanilla creature makes this card very bad. Now, Merfolk of the Pearl Trident has made it to 22nd place. This card doesn't need too much explanation. It's a vanilla creature, and it's just not worth playing. Next is Drowner Initiate, which is 21st. Now, the key of this card is to treat it as Merfolk of the Pearl Trident. Never pay the 1 unless your opponent has 2 cards in their library. I would not play this card, nor recommend playing it. If you do play it, never pay the 1. So for 20th place is Triton Shoretheif. This basically is Merfolk of the Pearl Trident, but it doesn't die to Renin 6. Although this card has 1 extra toughness, that doesn't make it playable. In 19th, I have Jade Bearer. So Jade Bearer has a problem. That is, you don't want to play this on turn 1. And when you do play it later on in the game, it becomes near useless. If you play this on turn 1, it's a green Merfolk of the Pearl Trident, which just sucks. On turn 2, you'll play a 2-drop like Silvergill Adept. And on turn 3, I can play this 1-drop and get a single +1/+1 counter. That effect later in the game isn't worth it, and I wouldn't suggest running this card. In 18th place is Jungle Delver. Now, this Merfolk has few redeeming qualities. You're paying 1 mana for a 1/1 vanilla creature. Then later you can pay a total of 5 mana for a 2/2 creature and 9 mana for a 3/3 creature. I don't want to spend too much time talking about this card. Just know not to put it in any of your Simic Merfolk decks, since the rates are just terrible. In 17th place came Merfolk Bonegnawer. So this Merfolk seems playable until you realize there are so many cards that will perform better. So I think this is best to compare with Relic of Progenitus. Now, in order to play Merrow Bonegnawer, you need to splash black, since I'm assuming your Merfolk list isn't a mirror. For Relic of Progenitus, you don't need to splash anything. If Merfolk Bonegnawer is being sided in, you are tapping this every single turn, so you're not going to attack or block with it. Merrow Bonegnawer can't tap the first turn, unlike Relic of Progenitus, and the list of differences goes on. Relic of Progenitus can be cycled. Merrow Bonegnawer can die to removal. It just doesn't make sense to play Merrow Bonegnawer, and I would suggest you stay far from it. For number 16, I have Mist-Cloaked Herald, and for number 15, I have Triton Shoretheif. I gave the edge to Triton Shoretheif because of the flavor text, since these cards perform identically. So I want you to view these as vanilla creatures with occasional upside. See, swinging in for 1 doesn't really matter unless you have a Lord out, but if you have a Lord out, you could easily have Island Walk, and even if you don't have Island Walk, it isn't worth it to have one of these creatures, since in the early game and in the late game, they do very little. I would not suggest playing these cards. In 14th place is Skywatcher Adept. At first, this is a 1/1 for 1, which isn't good. If you upgrade it once, it's a 4 mana 2/2 with flying, which still isn't good. Then if you get to the 3rd level, it's a 10 mana 4/2 with flying. The rates just suck, and flying, while relevant, isn't that relevant. This is not a good card, and I wouldn't recommend playing it. So Dakra Mystic made 13th, and this is a 1-drop that has a very interesting effect, yet it is not an effect that the Merfolk community wants, since you need to invest mana to slightly impact the top decks of both players, and we need to use all of our mana for interaction or to apply pressure, and Dakra Mystic just doesn't do that. For our 12th spot, I have Color of Gales, so this card will perform poorly. We already can push through for damage with Lord of Atlantis granting Island Walk, and investing mana into an effect that is mostly unnecessary makes this card weak and rather unplayable. In 11th, we have Enclave Cryptologist, so this will always be a 0/1 creature on its own, so the text has to be good, right? And if anything, it's lackluster. You need to invest 3 mana for a Merfolk looter with less power, and to get a pure draw effect, you need to pay 7 mana. This creature will die easily, and you will soak all of your resources into it until your opponent just kills it. It is a feel bad and will not typically perform well. Now, moving into our top 10, we have Merfolk Spy. Now, Merfolk Spy is a card that text box seems relevant, but it just isn't in most cases. Island Walk can be irrelevant if we have a Lord, or if our opponent just doesn't have islands. When you reveal a card, you're getting information. but how relevant is that information? It could be a land, and if our opponent does have relevant information, you should be able to predict it. You should be able to see if they have a counterspell coming, or a removal spell. The information gained with Merfolk Spy is most likely predictable or useless, and it isn't worth it. Late game, your opponent might not even have cards in hand, so I wouldn't suggest playing this card. For number 9, we have Tideshaper Mystic. This Merfolk has an interesting effect, but we can get Island Walk from Tideshaper and Spreading Seas. This creature needs to tap to use its effect, so we can't attack or block with it, and it doesn't deny our opponent their colors on their turn, so this card just feels kind of unnecessary. Merfolk Windrobber makes number 8, and this is the best Merfolk that can mill our opponent's library. Milling is a downside in most of the other Merfolk we have seen, but at least with this card you get a draw later in the game. I don't think this card is good, but we are starting to see more playable Merfolk 1-drops. Now, in 7th is Cosi's Trickster. This seems like the perfect answer for 4-color elemental decks, but there's one issue. Having a larger vanilla creature over time doesn't matter, and in the early game, this can get wiped out by Wrenn and 6 and Fury. In the late game, it doesn't matter so much, so this card just seems irrelevant most of the time. In 6th place is Rishadan Dockhand. So when you look up Merfolk 1-drops, Rishadan Dockhand seems promising, yet it just isn't as good as you would think it is. In order to use Rishadan Dockhand's ability to the Grace effect, you need to pay 1 mana every single turn to tap down your opponent's lands on their upkeep. This means on turn 2, you will most likely do nothing if you want to tap down lands of our opponents. Now, as most of you know, Merfolk is not very mana efficient. That is one of the multitude of reasons why we run Aether Vial. Now, if you are spending mana every single turn, you are going to set yourself behind much further than our opponent. If we tap down lands with Rishadan Dockhand every turn, we are not using it to attack or block, making the Island Walk worthless. Rishadan Dockhand is just 2 mana intensive, and most of the time it is not worth it. In number 5, we have Cursecatcher. This 1-drop used to be a very playable Merfolk. What has changed that makes Cursecatcher not so great anymore? Well, to start, removal has gotten more efficient over the years, and tacking on an extra mana doesn't do that much, and you can't even target Solitude or Fury with this, which are some of the most common forms of interaction, so this doesn't help in the way it used to when decks were slower and removal wasn't as efficient. That is why Cursecatcher doesn't see too much play, and it probably won't for a while if it will see play. For our number 4 slot, we have Kumena Speaker. So for a while, this saw play in Simic Merfolk, yet Simic Merfolk has changed to a Utopia Sprawl list, which doesn't run this card. So Kumena Speaker is a really aggressive Merfolk 1-drop, but other than that, it does nothing. In an aggressive Simic list, this could fit in, but do not splash green for it. This card does not really fit into any mono-blue Merfolk build. Now moving on into our top 3, we have a more controversial 1-drop, that is Mistcaller. Now Mistcaller has a variety of uses. It can shut down the Yawgmoth combo for a turn, or prevent the Living End combo. The only issue is, that is when the uses end. When you evoke in an elemental, it counts as casting, and will not prevent tokens, so Crashing Footfalls doesn't care. We already have plenty of hate for the Living End deck. I think this card needs to cover a wider array of decks in order to see sideboard or main deck play, yet unlike the other cards, I could picture a day where this does see play. For number 2, I have Benthic Biomancer. Now this is one of the better Merfolk 1-drop options. As of recording, this is in 38% of Merfolk decks, yet there are some flaws to this card. The biggest drawback is, what if you can't adapt this creature? It becomes a Merfolk of the Pearl Trident. Now it's not too hard to adapt this creature, but on turn 2, what are you doing? Are you going to adapt this creature instead of playing Lord of Atlantis or Silvergill Adept? No, of course you will play your creatures over upgrading Benthic Biomancer, but adapting this creature happens often in the late game. Yes, that is true, but later in the game, you are still not getting card advantage. Are you getting better card quality? Yes, but also note later in the game, your 1/1 becoming a 2/2 isn't near as relevant, and getting a single loot for 2 mana might not be the best deal, yet this card still sees some play, and the reason isn't because the card is powerful. It is because it is a better option than most. Imagine the cards in the Merfolk deck. What will happen if they die next turn? Silvergill Adept drew you a card. Lord of Atlantis helps get in for extra damage. Merfolk Trickster applied great tempo. Suiloon grants Ward 1, and if we untap with her, she is game-winning. While Benthic Biomancer is not a bad option, it's not an ideal 1-drop. Now for our number 1 slot is one of the most successful Merfolk 1-drops that has very consistently seen play in the Merfolk archetype since its printing. Yet there is only one drawback. Most of the time, it's a 2-drop. Yes, I'm talking about Tideshaper. Tideshaper does perform as a 1-drop versus Murktide, Control, and other decks when we need an early start, yet it just doesn't feel like a 1-drop, but it is our best 1-drop option. So now you have seen that most of our Merfolk 1-drop options are poor, and this is why most Merfolk decks don't run any at all, other than Tideshaper, which is basically a 2-drop. For the Merfolk archetype to become a strong deck, we need a powerful 1-drop to compete with the modern metagame. If you found this information useful, leave a like and comment below. I hope to see you next time.